Let's talk about some of the successes of Reconstruction. First off, it reunites the Union. We see here the seceding states and the year in which they were readmitted into the Union. That's important. We also have the Freedmen's Bureau, which we mentioned earlier. The Freedmen's Bureau was created right before the end of the war, and the Freedmen's Bureau is set up to supply food and clothing for freed slaves. This is our federal government's first attempt at social welfare. Other things that the Freedmen's Bureau did was they would negotiate labor contracts for African American workers and maybe their white bosses. They provided medical care to freed slaves. They had their own court system for labor and land disputes. And the Freedmen's Bureau officials were authorized to supervise black trials in other courts to make sure African Americans' rights were being upheld. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau had limited success due to the overwhelming racism that was present in the South. But the Freedmen's Bureau was also effective in legitimizing slave marriages, which may not have been recognized at the time. They also helped build schools for African American children, which is very important in the South. Most importantly, on the political side, African Americans gained the right to vote. Although they were illiterate, that is not that unique for the 1800s. Remember, many illiterate whites gained the right to vote when property requirements were dropped. Also, immigrants in cities in the North who may not have been able to read English were given the right to vote. Despite having the right to vote, African Americans have very limited representation. There are very few African Americans that actually get elected in the South during Reconstruction. And there are even fewer at the highest level, being sent to Washington, D.C. or serving in the top positions of state government. Nonetheless, efforts were made to register as many African American voters as possible. One organization that took the lead in this was the Union League of Philadelphia, which traveled down south and registered as many loyal white citizens and African Americans to the Republican Party as possible. The African Americans who were elected, many of them were military veterans. Remember, the military had provided an opportunity for education, learning how to read and write. It gave them experience in leadership. And so military veterans are going to form the core of black political leadership in the South. And they really gained a growth of nationalism from their military service as well. Overall, the Republican-backed governments of the South created new governments that had universal male suffrage, that reapportioned voting districts to more closely resemble population. In other words, voting was more fair and equal, and more of the state offices became elected, not appointed. That's more democratic. On the social side, African Americans formed their own churches, mainly Baptist at this time. African Americans preferred the Baptist sect of Protestant Christianity because of its decentralized nature, which allowed the congregation to make a lot of the decisions that were important to them. But regardless of the sect, the African American churches that formed really became the center of those black communities. And African Americans also formed community organizations as well to help out people in need. In terms of infrastructure, the Reconstruction period was largely successful in rebuilding the South. The railroads are reconstructed and even improved. Public roads and bridges are repaired and rebuilt. State-supported schools for white and black students received more funding and grew. And more attention is paid to the poor. More support is given to orphanages and asylums and institutions for the deaf and the blind for both races in the South. And overall, African Americans gain equality before the law. They have the right to own property. They have the right to carry on business. They have the right to enter professions. They have the right to attend school and learn how to read and write. Those are significant gains. And tomorrow, or next time, we'll talk about some of the limits on those gains. But those are significant gains we need to remember with Reconstruction. Finally, let's talk about the amendments of Reconstruction. All of these are sometimes called the Reconstruction Amendments or the Civil War Amendments. And we'll start with the 13th Amendment, which was ratified in December of 1865. By 1865, December, 3/4 of the states had ratified this constitution, or this amendment to the Constitution. And by that time, new state constitutions in the South or in the border states or the Emancipation Proclamation had really freed most of the slaves. By the time the 13th Amendment is ratified, there are really slaves in only 2 remaining states, Delaware and Kentucky. Nonetheless, the 13th Amendment brings about the war's most dramatic social change. An entire race is now officially freed from bondage. Also, the planter class loses significant political power. And with wealthy Southern elites no longer able to wield as much control over national politics, we see industrialists from the North gaining a lot more influence over politics. We'll talk about that more with the next unit. It also brings about significant economic change. The planter class loses a tremendous amount of wealth. By some estimates, $4 billion worth of labor is liberated through the 13th Amendment. In fact, the entire labor system is thrown off in the South, and that has long-lasting effects. Cotton and some of the other industries do not recover for over 20 years, and some industries like rice and hemp never fully recover. The 14th Amendment guarantees citizenship for all American-born persons, except Indians. It's mainly saying that African Americans born here in the United States have full legal equality. The 15th Amendment guarantees African Americans the right to vote. However, it was divisive. The women's rights movement was upset about the 14th and especially the 15th Amendment because it specifically states race but does not say gender. In fact, 2 prominent women's rights advocates, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, campaigned against the 15th Amendment, not because they felt African Americans should be denied the right to vote, but because they thought this was a missed opportunity to extend the right to vote to women. Other suffragettes, other women's rights advocates, such as Lucy Stone, who we see here, supported the 15th Amendment and said women can wait a few years for the right to vote. But nonetheless, the 15th Amendment is going to divide the women's rights movement for almost 20 years. Next time we'll examine how these amendments did not have as much of an immediate impact as some had hoped, but we need to keep in mind they were essential to the civil rights movements of the 20th century.